Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Goff, Principal Product Marketing here at Revenera, and I'm glad you could join us for today's conversation with Juan Rodriguez, Product Director at Solibri, the market leader in model checking software operating in the building information modeling space. Today, we're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about defining success metrics to improve software customer value. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And if we don't get to them live, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Juan, welcome, and thanks for joining us today to talk about Solibri's journey. I know we have a copy of the Solibri case study available here on our webcast platform, but for those who might be unfamiliar with Solibri, can you give us a quick overview?
Yep. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. So a little bit of an overview of what we do with Solibri. In Solibri, we want to provide services and solutions for construction companies that are trying to work and define their projects. And because construction is a very complex industry, there's many trades, many companies, and many different people working in the same project at the same time. What we want to provide in Solibri are quality assurance tools to make sure that the project quality is always on the level that it should be. So this is the focus that we have. We look into 3D models, analyze the data, analyze the geometry, and make sure that your project complies to the requirements.
Great. And from our discussions, I know that in 2017, Solibri set a goal to be more data-driven. So maybe before we get into the success metrics, we should talk about the data that you're using to define and measure those metrics. Can you give us a sense of the different ways you collect data on your users to understand their needs and to help them build better products for them?
So we look into how our users are interacting with our products. We also look a little bit on the patterns of how often they use the product, so understanding a bit on how active are the users. So these are typical metrics that we care about also, like how much do we keep monthly active users or daily active users. Then when it comes to the behavior of the, let's call it in-product customer journey, then we care a lot about what are the main functionalities that we have within the product and what is the journey that the users have within the product, and then try to understand what different features or components in the product are actually taking more advantage of. And if they are not, what can we do to help them?
Okay, so that makes sense. So with that data then, how do you define success metrics at Solibri, and what areas are you looking at specifically?
Yeah, so this is something that we started to look quite much last year, so during 2020. Before we were looking more into the patterns of the behavior, trying to understand how people were using the software, but we were not looking into when we do new development, how do we actually make sure that this is a successful new development? Because this is something that has been maybe overlooked in the past. So now we try to see that when we do a new feature, what is it that we want to achieve with this one? What is it that we are actually going to look to track to make sure that this new feature is being used? But of course, we also have success metrics around the whole usage of the product. So our product offers different quality checks for the users. So we also want to look into what kind of checks the users are using and how can we promote or make some of those checks that maybe they're being used less, to make them better, or to promote them better, or to explain them better.
And when you and I have talked, you've highlighted the fact that there's a difference between success metrics and key performance indicators, or KPIs. I think a lot of people consider those to be fairly synonymous. So could you explain what you mean by that?
So for me, when you talk about a KPI, then you're looking more into, let's take it the other way around. If you were to look into metrics, so when you look at success metrics, you want to see that, well, what are the metrics that I want to look into that I think that are going to help a new feature or the product for the users? So for us, you could think that success metrics or metrics that we should pay attention is what are the checks that the users are using, how much are they using them, where is the distribution on the project, and does this pattern continues to be the same over time? When I think more about KPIs, then I'm looking more about what are the ones that are going to define the success of the business and also the success of the product. So here I'm looking more into metrics, but also a target for the metric. So for example, you could say that your monthly active users in Revenera might be, I don't know how many, let's say 500,000. Then your KPI could be that you had to be always consistently hitting the 500,000 active users. And then you can consider that that's a success KPI.
Great. So how do you go about capturing and measuring those success metrics that you have identified, and maybe give a few examples of what those are and what they look like?
Yeah, so I already mentioned like monthly active users. That's something that we definitely look at. And we actually want to see that this is something that it stays in a certain level on. Of course, it is increasing over time because it's something that is very important for us to understand that our customer retention is there. That is, our users are actually getting the value that they need from our product. The other metrics and success metrics that we are considering and that we think that are very important is how the users are using the different features in the product. So our users are our users actually looking into how are they expert users or they are not so expert users? So we want to follow also these metrics and make sure that we understand how we can define the user personas based on the different models that we build with the metrics that we gather.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know you and I have chatted before about Dave McClure's so-called pirate metrics, acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. And those have been the focus for many software startups since the mid-2000s. How have you guys used those metrics, and which ones do you focus on most?
Yes, this is an interesting one because to a certain degree, some of them we are tracking more actively than others. But this is something that we would like to actually take into consideration more and actually be able to track all these metrics. In a way, these are very interesting because it mimics quite close final acquisition of customers and actually how do you keep them engaged. So for us, we look into things like acquisition from the point of view that how many of users are actually going and using our trial product. We also look into things like activation, obviously, when there's a customer turn into from a trial user to an actual customer that is paying for the software. Retention, of course, is key. So we want to look a lot into how do we make our product that is something that users really like to use and that they come and continue using. So here we are looking into things like monthly active users, but we are also looking into things like are they actually using the typical, the most important features in the product and making sure that there's no dropouts in that journey. When it comes to the referral, this is the one that at this point maybe we're not very actively tracking, and this is something that we want to maybe more actively track, is like how do you measure something like an NPS score that you can see that are your users actually promoting your content to others? Are your users actually love it so much, your products, that they are actually your best ambassadors? So this is something that we actually want to see how we could look into implementing this into the product, where you have many times that you have this in banner or within the product that you can rate the product and say that, is this something that you would be recommending to somebody else on a scale from 1 to 10? And then, of course, revenue. This is something that obviously we are tracking as probably any other business and looking into how actually the whole funnel translates into actual sales.
Right. So you mentioned user engagement, and I know that you're focusing on ease of use and moving toward in-product education and tutorials to help with trial conversions. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you guys are doing?
Yep. So actually, we are looking now into starting using the in-product advertisement or in-product tutorials that Revenera provides as a way to help our users adopting the product. Because obviously, our tool, our software has been over years, and some of the parts have not been maybe so focused or so very much paid attention when it comes to the actual design. So this is something that we are looking now into. How can we make the journey of using the product easily by our users? So we are looking into, one side is that we are trying obviously to make the experience for the users better, and we are focusing on the product design. And this is also something that we want to keep the success metrics based on that development. But also we want to make sure that we help the users follow that journey within the product. Just think about when you're using some, like if you're using a game, or there are many tools that nowadays, modern tools do this, that they actually help you on the first experiences that you have within the product. That is telling you, hey, maybe you want to create a new project. Maybe you want to load some resources or some models into your product. Once you have the models in your project, now probably you would like to check your project for the quality. First, before you have to do the check, you have to set a couple of parameters. So building that journey for the user, making it easier for them to start working with Solibri, obviously.
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? I mean, I think a lot of people are sort of used to that experience in SaaS applications these days. So when you have a more mature product that's on premise, to be able to offer that functionality to help guide people through the onboarding, is tremendously helpful. And one of the interesting opportunities. Sorry, go ahead.
No, definitely, that's very interesting for us.
Yeah, and I was about to say, so one of the interesting opportunities within that messaging is the ability to do sort of a quick thumbs up or thumbs down qualitative survey of users who have used a specific feature a certain number of times based on the usage analytics you're collecting. So how is Solibri balancing quantitative and qualitative data, and how does that play into your success metrics?
So in most of the cases, when we are actually doing new features or planning new features or planning new products even, we always try to be very data-driven. So we always try to look in all the data available, try to understand the behavior of the users. Especially if we see drops, it's like, what could we do to actually make the life easier for our users? So we have recently changed one of the main features, because it was difficult to build, difficult to continue expanding in the future. So what we did with that one is like, we understand that there is limitations, that people are not using it as much as they could. So what we do in the product is that we check a model. The next logical thing is that the person that checks the model is not actually the person that fixes the design. So this information has to be transferred to somebody else. So we saw that there was a drop on the amount of check and the amount of information that was generated while you were checking, and the amount of information that was then transferred to the person that actually has to work with it. So we look into this data, and then we started to basically try to validate that, is this something that really happens, and how could we make it easier for the users to do this transition? So here we started to plan a new feature to try to be able to replace the existing one and improve it. And then here also, once we did our planning based on all the metrics that we saw and the data that we actually got from Revenera, then we look into how can we actually plan the new version. Once we have a plan, then we validate with the user. So we would like to have a very close relationship with users. Usually when you do actual validation, it's a limited amount of users because you cannot gather from everybody, but try to be able to have that conversation and that validation on the initial problem, and then on the actual solution that you are proposing, and then involving them on the journey with the prototyping, testing, beta testing, whatever it is that we continue forward.
Right. And Solibri's been using, usage analytics for a while. You just mentioned Revulytics, obviously now part of Revenera. Sorry. That's okay. That's okay. But, one of my favorite things from when we talked, a couple of years back and we were working on the case study is, the fact that you were collecting data, and just 6 weeks in, you were able to make some decisions based on that data. And that's in the case study. So I'll suggest people download that to read more about that. But you've been using usage analytics for a while now, and you've actually started to leverage it in your company dashboard. So can you tell us a
Yes.
little bit about the process of making that happen, the types of data that you're bringing in, how senior leadership is using it, and then maybe talk about the value that it's delivering?
Yeah. So we didn't want to, maybe the first idea that I had with this one, it was just to put the dashboard that tells you everything that never happens realistically. But what would be a dashboard that would make sense for you and for pretty much everybody in the company to understand how we are doing in a, let's say, month-to-month basis? So what we built is that with our data scientists, we build like a 30-day snapshot of how the company is doing. So here we thought about, okay, what are all the sources of information, data and information, basically, that we have in the whole company. So we look into, okay, our CRM, where do we log our sales, the actual usage of the software, the monthly, the active users. So we look into all this data. So we build basically a dashboard that is still evolving, by the way. It's not a definite one, and probably will never be, like nothing is nowadays anyways, and that's good. What we started with is like, okay, let's define first what is retention for us, what is important to keep that retention. So it's a little bit going back to the R metrics. So what is the actual retention that we have in the users? So we have the monthly active users. We also have the revenue that we have in that 30 days period compared to actually the last year's same period of time. We also look into support cases that has been coming in. We also look into, I'm thinking now, what is the other one that it's related to the to the retention or the referral that we are using. So referral is we don't have anything, as I was saying earlier. And actually in the dashboards, I think that at this point, we don't have anything on the acquisition. So this is something that we actually want to look into. How can we actually keep or bring the information of the trial usage also into the dashboard? So then we start to keep a little bit this simplified dashboard that contains relatively similar information like we have been talking in this metric. So how much people are using our trial for the acquisition part, how much people are actually then turning, how many of those trial users are turning into paying customers. So it gives you an idea of the activation part. The retention, we look into the monthly active users. Then we look also into the referrals, something that we still have to look into, how we bring things like KPIs there, and actually then the revenue. And we look towards the last year, so we have an idea that how did we do in the previous one, and are we growing or not in this period of time?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things I always find about talking to product teams, starting with usage analytics, is sort of the discovery that takes place as you look at the data, and the light bulb goes off, and you start asking questions. Are you experiencing that with the company dashboard too? Like, are people on the senior leadership team looking at some of those usage analytics and then asking questions that make you then go back and say, "Oh, that's a really good question." Is that happening? And how's that team sort of reacting to the data that you're bringing into the larger company dashboard?
So at this point, we are still now so we had a first version that we were using mainly internally. Now we are trying to transition now to start using this with the management team. But this already has bring a lot of ideas on how could we pay attention on how things or how some of our actions actually impact our users. So for example, if we do a heavy promotion, does that somehow translate into the usage that we see in the software, or actually does it translate into actual number of new sales? So we have been seeing a lot of the relationships there, and that has been very valuable. And I think that some of the maybe most valuable are the unknowns that you never thought that those things would be happening, and that's something that I think that has helped us learn also in the past. I think that probably one of the first ones that we noticed is that when we pull all the data from the different data sources, from the software analytics and the insights that we get there, is that we saw that we have a lot of checking capabilities. You can think this like automated testing that we are building for these design projects. And I would say that we have about 55 checks that can be customizing actually gathered together in many, many different ways. So basically, you end up with endless possibilities. But one of the assumptions is that, yes, people are using some more than others. But what we didn't know is that the difference is really big. Some of them are really, really, really heavily used, while others are actually very, very little used. But there's a good reason for that. Some of those checks, actually, you need to run them potentially maybe once a day. But some others, because of the nature of how they are built, it means that people are using the same check perhaps even 100 times on one time that they are actually checking the whole model. So then it gives you this kind of disparity on the data that first looks like, wait a moment, what's going on here? No, but there's a good reason why this is happening.
Yeah, and you touched on this earlier, and it's sort of interesting. That really gets to the heart of, there's a difference between data, information, analytics, insight, right? And there's still a huge role for product teams to bring their experience into that discussion of, why does the data look this way? What's driving that? And I think that's also probably where some, qualitative data, information, feedback, yes, then, plays into really understanding it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, yes, like everything, there's never an absolute truth. So data is super important, and I love data. Is not the only thing that we have to pay attention to. The same as it's not just the quality data, the one that we have to pay attention to only. So it's always a balance between both worlds, and actually how do you actually use the reasoning behind the information that you see on how people are behaving with your product, and then the actual what you hear from the users. Because these things can contradict sentence. So there's always the funny situations that somebody says that they're doing this, but then the reality is that that's something that you don't see very often happen. So there's always a balance, and try to understand that, yes, this might be happening, but this might be happening in the UK, but it's not happening in the US. So there's always a good reason why there's these patterns that you can identify within the product. And also there's, I think that you touched on an important point, is like there's room for product management, there's room for all the different data scientists. I think that I'm starting to see that on the long term, what is going to be is there going to be some kind of hybrid between product management and the data data scientists that actually are much more data-driven product management that can actually be able to balance the best of both worlds. So you start to see how professions are changing over time. And that's not even going into things like machine learning, AI, because gathering all this data, it opens the doors to actually start to understand patterns and potentially start to do suggestions to your users about how to do the best practices. Like, well, you typically set a parameter to go a certain way, but we notice that you always set it the same way, so maybe this is the way that you would like to do it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the fact that you're using usage analytics, you can now segment your users either by geography or frequency of use of certain features, and then ask them those subjective survey questions where you're getting that qualitative feedback. So those are good points. So to wrap things up, maybe can you share what's been the most surprising insight that you've had into your customer's journey? Is there one success metric that's really jumped out at you as being maybe more valuable or more interesting than you might have thought initially?
So I think that if I think about, a surprising one was that maybe not the success one is when we started using the software analytics, we noticed that we have users who are Windows users and users who are Mac users. So the perception is that Mac users, we probably have a very large or quite sizable amount of Mac users, because when you think architects, the logical thing to think is that they're all using Mac computers. But when we started to look in the data, we noticed that it was maybe a little bit over 5% of the users that were using Mac, which was actually quite a big surprise to think that, okay, so maybe not all architects are actually using Mac computers, which for me was kind of shocking, not necessarily something related to a success, but it was something that it was quite shocking for me. When it comes to success, I think it's more like what we have been doing now in the past is that when we have been planning a new feature, how we have been planning before we release the feature, what is going to define the success of this feature. So I was saying earlier about this one that we changed the way that the users find the problems in a design and then they communicate it outside. So the communication part was not happening. But now when we have introduced this change, when most of our users are moving to the latest version, we notice that there's the ratio of users that are actually communicating those problems compared to the ones that are actually checking their models has jumped a lot compared to the previous versions. And that's already, for me, a really good way to understand that data is telling me what is the success of my development, which is really key because in the past, many times when you have developed new features, it has been blindly doing it so and hoping for the best. And you never were quite sure what was happening. So I think that this is very important for me as a metric and as a success metric.
Yeah, that's interesting. And actually, a question came up in the chat. So it's interesting. You've been using software usage analytics for a while now. Has it enabled you to do more experimentation and sort of what you're just getting at with testing assumptions? Knowing that you're going to have that data when you roll out a new feature.
Yeah, I think that it has been helping us to move in directions that we probably wouldn't have thought about earlier, and also understand better where do we have to put the effort. So earlier it was all about talking, and talking is great. I mean, talking with a customer is great. The reality is when I talk with a customer, I can dedicate 1 hour, and then I can go to talk with another customer another hour. And maybe you can do this once a week or twice a week or 3 times a week, depends. But then the amount of customers that you can actually talk is limited. So being able to gather all this data from different sources and then just using then the discussions with the customers for the validation part, this is really important for us. So I think that this has been a really good enabler for us to understand how to move forward, how to actually leverage the understanding of the insights that we are getting when we are doing the planning.
That's great. So Juan, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you taking the time today to be here and to share your thoughts and your experiences on success metrics. And a quick plug, if you've enjoyed our conversation, please be sure to check out Juan's YouTube channel, Inside the Product, which is a really great resource for product management professionals. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We will follow up with an email in the next 48 hours with a link to the recording of today's discussion. But please feel free to reach out with any questions you have in the meantime. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.